everybody. It's me, Jessica from You, Me, and Whimsy, back again with a story of a quilt or a quilt story. I don't know which way I want to refer to it, but we're having the story of a quilt today. I have been working on a custom order for several weeks now, from about the middle of March till the middle of May. Um, it it was a very large project, which I'll get into in a moment. But first, I want to share the story of how this quilt came to be. First of all, I was a teacher for many years at a local school in my area, and I've taught many students and worked with many people. And it just so happens that this mom who commissioned me to make this quilt saw some of my other work and asked me to make a t-shirt quilt for her daughter, who was a former student of mine. And I just so happened to work with the mom and the dad at the school for many years. And it's a very special sort of situation because they were, my friends and coworkers. And the husband or the father of the young lady who the quilt was commissioned for, he came in and saved the day at my wedding when I didn't have music to walk down the aisle to. And he walked in on me one day crying in my classroom because I didn't have any music, and he said, "Well, I will handle it. Don't you even worry." And he did, and it was amazing. So, just a very special story of two creative people who, you know, came together. Anyway, so the daughter, just who I taught, I'm pretty sure in fourth and fifth grade and middle school. I might be a little bit wrong about that, but definitely through middle school. She just graduated from UGA, which is really exciting. So proud of you. Yay, Sarah. Good job. And her mom and dad decided to commission a quilt for me that had all of her t-shirts from her entire life of school. So from the time she was in pre-K all the way up to even, in college times. So I have she brought me all the t-shirts, and I made a quilt design that I gave them three options, and they chose one, and that's the one that I went with. So I'm really excited to tell you more about this quilt. Okay, so before we dig into this footage, I need to talk to you about the sheer size of this quilt. To make a t-shirt quilt, you want to make sure you have a large portion of the big logo on the t-shirt. That's what's going to make it beautiful. That's what's going to make the design interesting to look at. So I made the size of the squares for the logo 12 by 12, which meant, depending on how many columns I made and how many rows I made, the quilt could get large fast. When I talked to the mom, Amy, the lady who commissioned it, she said, make it as large as you can. And so I just began. I made three designs. They chose one. We agreed upon it. And I got started cutting up things and getting things ready and sewing. And it kind of got away from me before I quite realized how large it was going to be. I just got really excited into the design and what I was making. And then at some point I realized, wow, this is going to be a huge quilt. It's going to be like a king size quilt. So each square is 12 by 12. I had 9 squares going across, and so 9 columns and 10 rows, each 12 by 12. So that made for a 9-foot by 10-foot quilt, which is huge, right? Anyway, so it was a little bit of a challenge, but I love a challenge. I so enjoyed making this. It was really fun. I loved the problem solving that came with it. Like I said, it was a challenge, but it was okay with me. And so I always feel like my husband and friends and family are always like, do people actually realize when you talk about these quilts? Do you tell them exactly how many hours it takes for these things to be made? And I was like, well, I like to think they can see it in the footage that I share, but I'm not really sure that people do. So I'm just going to tell you guys. Like I said, this was a 9-foot by 10-foot quilt, and I worked on it from about the middle of March to the middle of May, and definitely all of the month of April. So that was about 200, no, not, that was about 53 days. I did take a few days here and there off, but it was only added up to a total about 2 weeks total. So that was about 39 days. I figured this up on a little notepad because I wasn't even sure my own self. And some days I worked 4 hours, some days I worked 6 hours, some days I worked 8 hours. It just depended on what I had going on that day. Um, so I just called it an average of 6 hours per day for 39 days, which added to up to 234 hours. So yeah, that's a lot of hours that went into this quilt, but I don't regret a moment of it. And seeing I'll show you at the end the pictures of Sarah opening the quilt and the joy she saw, you could see in her face, which was the whole point, right? So anyway, let's get into this video. Before we do, though, I have a few cats that hang out with me in my studio when I'm working. They're not always around, but sometimes they like to come in and just look at what I'm doing because they're cats. So I thought it'd be fun to have a little game this time in the footage and see how many cats you all can see in them. So we're going to call them cat cameos. And I'd like for you to, at the end of the video in the comments, just tell me how many cats you see because I counted. So a few of them I gave you little clues. I put little word bubbles and stuff to give you a clue that there's a cat nearby. But so let's just see how many cat cameos you all can find. I hope you enjoy the footage and see you in a little bit. Okay, so here in part 1 we're going to begin prepping the t-shirts and cutting the t-shirts so that they will be ready for the next steps, which will be sewing and so on and so forth. So the first thing you're going to see me do here in this footage is I'm preparing the t-shirts with interfacing. Interfacing can be iron on or you can sew it onto your fabric. It is used for any kind of stretchy or silky fabric that slips and moves or stretches easily when you go through the sewing process. So most t-shirts are made of a cotton knit fabric. Knit is just a technique in which the cotton thread is knitted and are processed into a piece of fabric. So and the knitting process creates a very stretchy fabric that can stretch in both width and length. So you must, when you're using fabrics that are stretchy or silky like that, you must attach them to some interfacing because that just creates a more structured situation for sewing these. So that is what this first part of this footage is doing here. I've cut pieces of interfacing and I am attaching them to the front side of the t-shirt and the back side of the t-shirt. I've cut all of the t-shirts into 2 sections. I cut the sleeves off and cut them into 2 sections, the front side and the back side. And that is what I'm attaching the interfacing to, is the front and back side of the t-shirts. Alright, now the next step in this part is to cut the t-shirts into the strips and into the large 12x12 logo pieces that I need. You can see here I'm using a rotary cutter and a large quilt template cutting square. It's an acrylic or plastic square with measurements and stuff on it that help quilters cut things neatly and accurately. I am using that 12x12 square to cut the nice large logo out of each t-shirt. This is going to be the main part of the design of the t-shirts, is the big logo in remembrance of Sarah's time in school. And then I am using the blank part of the t-shirts to create the strips that are going to make up the patchwork or pieced together patchwork design that we agreed upon when I gave the family choices. To mention here that Interfacing also helps with ease of cutting and sewing, so that is another reason that interfacing was used on these t-shirts. Okay, in this next part, I'm going to be sewing, ironing, and trimming all these strips together to create to create rectangles that will be cut into 10 by 10 squares. I needed to get 12 by 12 squares out of these strips, but when I did the calculations for the design that we chose, I realized I did not have enough fabric to get 12 by 12 squares from the t-shirt, the strips from the t-shirt. So instead, I'm just going to cut them into 10 by 10 squares and then attach them or frame them to another piece of fabric, which we'll talk about later. So here I am. I'm taking these strips and I'm just sewing them together. Front side, I placed the two front sides together, and then I'm just sewing a 1/4 inch seam into the edge there of each grouping. And once that is done, I will then press the seams open with a hot iron. This is just sort of a craftsmanship thing. It helps create kind of a structure to the stitch, or the hem, or the seam, whatever you want to call it, and keeps it from kind of busting open in the process of the other things that will be going on with this quilt. Also, it just helps the fabric look nice and better and give it a crisp sort of look and edge to it when you're pressing the seams open. Okay, so now that I've pressed all the, I've sewn these together and I've pressed the seams, I am now taking my rotary cutter and my 12 by 12 template there and cutting these into 10 by 10 squares. You can see where I'm removing some of the strips because I don't really need them, and if I cut it, it's going to, or if I remove it, it'll make the square look more accurate. Because I want to mention, in the sewing together of these strips, they still warped a little bit even though there was interfacing. You can see, like, the one I'm removing now, that strip, it got warped a little bit, and because it did, it made it wider on one end and more narrow on the other end when I cut it, because it didn't stretch evenly, obviously, so when I sewed the strips together. So then I'm removing some of the ones that kind of looked wonky and funny, just as a craftsmanship and sort of deal, because, you know, when you're making something beautiful, you want it to be as beautiful as possible, right? So that's what I'm doing, just cutting these into 10 by 10 squares in preparation for the next part. Okay, so now that I have everything trimmed up and ready, I can start framing these pieced squares onto these other pieces of fabric. So, like I said before, I only had enough stripped fabric to create 10 by 10 squares, but in order for the quilt design to work correctly, I had to either add a border around the 10 by 10 square or do what's called framing them. And so what I'm doing here is getting them framed onto some fabric. I am removing them I had already attached some to this pink fabric, and then I realized I wanted to introduce some gray fabric into this design element of the quilt. So I removed some of the ones from this pink fabric that I want to be on the gray fabric, and now I am attaching the other to the pink, and then I will do the gray fabric with the other squares. So like I said, this was just a design choice that came about because of I had to work out the problem of not having enough fabric from the t-shirts that were given to me, and so this was my solution, was framing the pieced stripped squares with some pink dusty rose fabric because it's Sarah's favorite color, and then I introduced another neutral color, a gray color, just to help balance out all of the color palette here, because the t-shirts definitely, when I did the design, I separated them into kind of two different groupings of color palette, and I decided that one grouping looked better with the pink and the other grouping looked better with the gray when I was framing these up and solving that problem. So that is where this framing situation comes from, was because I needed to make the 10 by 10 square 12 by 12 square. And when I'm gluing these, you can see that I'm measuring to make sure I'm leaving an equal amount of space around each 10 by 10 square when I'm gluing it to the 12 by 12. The glue I'm using is just some applique glue, so that it does not move in the process of sewing the quilt topper together and quilting it and all the things that I must do for the next parts to complete this quilt. going to pause here to mention that I lost some footage whenever I was creating the rows of these squares. When all was said and done and I had everything prepped and ready, I thought I turned the camera on, but I didn't. So before the next part, before part 4, there was a whole nother section of footage that showed me sewing all of these 90 squares and making 10 rows out of the 90 squares that I'm now going to sew together in the next part. Okay, in part 4, we are completing the quilt topper and basting, or getting it ready for basting. This is the most exciting part of the whole thing, is finishing the quilt topper, because it's the main visual part of the quilt that everybody looks at. So you can see here how I am putting, like I said, I had 10 rows that I completed in the lost footage. And I am taking these, I'm putting 2 rows together. I'm using my phone to make sure I'm put the correct rows with one another based on the design that I created. And so I'm just pinning them, or I'm clipping them. I'm using these spiffy red clips instead of pins, but you could pin them if you wanted to. Anyway, if you had no other choice, I suppose. I just really like these clips. They're very easy and convenient. Anyhow, so I'm just putting the 2 rows together, clipping them, and once I'm done with that, I will begin to sew those 5 groupings of fabric, or 5 groupings of rows together, and that will complete the quilt topper. Okay, so now that is done, I am now getting the backing and batting ready to do the next part. Because the quilt is so large and I couldn't find fabric or batting that was wide enough, I had to get fabric and cut it into strips that I then sew together to create a wide enough piece of fabric to create the backing. And also, this white fabric you see is the batting, and I'm pinning that together and doing the same thing. I had to take it and cut it into 3 parts so that I can then sew them together and make it wide enough to go with the quilt topper, which is a 9 by 10 foot piece of quilt. Is a 9 by 10 foot quilt topper. So that's what I'm doing here. Okay, for this next part 5, we're going to be doing what's called basting the quilt together. Basting is when you make sure that you are pinning all 3 layers of the quilt together. A quilt is made of 3 layers: the top, the topper, the quilt topper, which is the beautiful part, the colorful part. The middle part is called the batting. That's what gives it its volume or its loft. And the backing. The backing is just obviously the other side of the quilt. So what I'm doing here is pinning, making sure that I'm using these special things called basting pins, and I'm pinning all 3 layers together all over. I'm going to give you a closer look in a minute. I want you to notice how some of those striped squares are kind of falling off. They're coming unglued for some reason. I think it must be because the humidity in my area and the weather has gotten much higher. It's gotten hotter, and I live in the south, and so the humidity just is awful. It's like a sauna. Anyway, so I think that's why some of them have come loose, but I'm going to fix that later, and I'll talk about what I do to help that situation. So now here you can see I'm showing you a little bit more up close what basting looks like. I'm basically sticking 4 basting pins on all 4 edges of the square, leaving a little bit of room in between each pin to stitch on the area where the squares come together, the seam where they were sewed together in the quilt topper part when I was doing that part. So here you can see I'm doing some more pinning of the basting. You can see here, well, I have a couple of regular straight pins in that particular square because it was coming undone from the glue. That applique glue was pretty good. Like I said, I just think it was the humidity. Anyway, so this is what you do to prepare the quilt for quilting. As you stitch in the ditch, or however you decide to quilt it, you have lots of different options. But I'm going to choose to stitch in the ditch. What it does is it brings those areas together where you've stitched it, and it creates a volume that's in the shape of the particular area that you have stitched. So for example, I'm going to be stitching in the ditch of each of these stripes. So each stripe will have a slight bit of volume or quilt type looking thing to it because I stitched in those particular areas to give it some volume. Right, so now I am officially quilting this very large quilt. So I have basted it, and now I'm doing what's called stitching in the ditch. I've already done several of these other squares. I kind of skipped through some of the footage. This was a 3-hour long video. Once I put all the hours of footage together, it's filmed in hyperlapse, or time lapse as they call it, and so it was only 3 hours, but I spent many more hours on it than that. Anyway, so I'm at one end, and I just thought it was easier to show this footage to see what I'm doing. And so basically, this is why basting is so important, because as you're working, those pins help to keep all of it together so that you don't miss a layer of the quilt. So you can see that I have done several of those in that one row, and I'm just kind of cleaning them up and taking the pins out. So I kind of stopped there at the end because I was having a frustration, which is that some of these squares, as I'm quilting these ones in particular, these striped ones, they kept moving over and over and over again. So that applique glue, I don't know if I just didn't use enough or it was just too humid. I'm not sure. If I ever do one of these again, I'll probably use some more interfacing or some stitch witchery or something to make sure that the squares are stuck together better for the applique part, because they kept moving around and I kept having to take a whole bunch of stitches out and then redoing it. So I decided to change up my method of pinning these. So I started taking pins out when I was done with the areas and pinning more pins into the actual striped areas, because to keep it from moving so much. So there's probably like, let's see, I think there was 6 across, so like 18 pins in each one of those striped squares to keep it from moving around as I was quilting it. Process where I'm pinning a whole bunch of pins into that striped square. I take them out once I finish a row. I take all the pins out and then reuse them in the next row. The way quilting works is you're supposed to start in the very center square, and whatever areas you're doing in that one square, you start in the center of that particular square and just work your way out. I kind of did mine a little bit differently, but I did start from the center. I did all the striped squares first. I did stitching in the ditch there, and then I continued out from there. Then I quilted all the rows across the top of the squares and across the bottom of the squares, and then I turned the quilt and started doing it in the columns. I did all the columns, starting in the middle, going from the top of the column to the bottom of the column. and part 7, we're binding the quilt. There are lots of different ways to bind your quilt. You can create your own bias tape. You can buy bias tape. Um, this is always how I've done it. I've just purchased bias tape and used it to bind my quilt. I'm using pretty thin bias tape here. It is 1/2 inch wide bias tape, and I used about three packets that are 3 yards each. So anyway, just putting the bias tape on, you pin the one side of the bias tape onto the back of your quilt, and then you sew it, making sure to miter the corners. A miter corner is just creating a 90-degree angle in something that you're crafting or creating. Then you flip the quilt over, and you flip the other side, like you pull the bias tape around from the back to the front side, and then pin it, and then you finish that. And then that's wrapping around the part of the quilt where you can see the layers, so it's finishing it off so you don't see the raw edges. And that's what binding the quilt is for, why it's done. And then as you're doing that, you're finishing the mitered corners as you sew that onto the front side of the quilt. All right, so we're almost done. This last part is just what I call the fine tuning and cleaning up stage. This is part 8, our 8th and final part of this project. I'm taking a lint roller and I'm just making sure to get any stray thread off of there, and at the same time, when I find a thread that is still attached, I cut it off and make sure I get my lint roller over it. This is just a part of craftsmanship and making sure that your work is perfect and beautiful as it could possibly be. I also found some areas, some small sections that frayed out away from the stitches for whatever reason. So I'm cutting off the frayed edges, and I'm just hand sewing them back on, just with a simple little straight stitch with my hand, just to make sure that there is no edge that's coming up that's going to get caught on anything when it is in use. That was such a fun project. I hope you enjoyed that footage. I did all of it in time lapse, so it ended up only being 3 hours of time lapse. I don't exactly know how 234 hours got compressed into 3 hours of time lapse. There was some footage that I deleted. I shortened a bunch of it because who wants to watch a 3-hour video? An hour or so was long enough, but I didn't want to cut out too much. So, yeah, and also I didn't realize how many times I pulled my phone out in the middle of filming to text or have a phone call or whatever, and I deleted some of those sections out because y'all don't need to see that either. But anyway, how many cat cameos did you see? Because I counted 16. So I would love to know how many you saw in the comments. 16 cat cameos in there. I have 5 cats and 1 dog, but the dog didn't really make an appearance. He doesn't like the sound of the sewing machine, so he was nowhere near me during the sewing time. But anyway, the cats are, well, curious. So Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this footage, and I hope to see you guys with my next project. Check out some of my other videos, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!